Hi, I'm Femi Okay.
And I'm Malika Bilal, and you're in the stream.
Today, election meddling and US relations, but from a Russian perspective. We'll hear what some Russians think about the headlines dominating US media.
We also want to hear your take on Russia-US relations. Send us your comments via Twitter or live on YouTube.
The November midterm elections in the US could end Republican dominance in the House and also in the Senate. US media is focusing on campaigns and also on the question of Russian meddling. Will the US see a repeat of the 2016 election interference, as alleged by the FBI? And to what extent are Russia's online trolls trying to influence American voters' opinions?
Today, we want to hear Russian perspectives on how they view this and other news stories, as well as the bigger picture of Russia-US relations. Joining us to do that via Skype from Moscow, Anna Nemtsova, Moscow correspondent for the Daily Beast and Newsweek. In Boston, Alla Baranovsky, a PhD candidate at Harvard University. She studies social media, Russian politics, and Russia's influence on public opinion abroad. And in New York, Uliana Malashenko, a journalist and contributor to Russian media outlets, including Kommersant, Expert TV, and TV Rain. Welcome to the stream, everyone. Let's start with meddling. I want to share a tweet sent to the stream from Yuval Weber, Associate Professor of Russian and Eurasian Studies at Daniel Morgan Graduate School here in Washington, D.C. This is what he says. The meddling, to whatever extent, has dashed Trump's and Putin's hopes for a pragmatic relationship and turned Russia into a partisan issue in the U.S. Everything that Democrats dislike about Trump and his policies can be traced to the original sin, in quotes there, of Russian help during the election. Anna, when it comes to this issue, do you agree with what Yuval says here?
I do, but if we think and look at things from Russian perspective, and I've been traveling around Russian regions this year a lot, people think that America is a threat, and they more and more feel concerned about the relationships between the United States and Russia getting spoiled more and more. People are afraid of the war. My taxi driver in Siberia asked me about the war, if the war is coming, and he said that for as long as Putin is the president, he hopes that the war with the United States doesn't happen. I'm just trying to explain to you how ordinary Russians see the situation. They do not follow the news. They do not read about Mueller's investigation. They're just worried about their future and the future of their children.
I'm wondering what everyday Russians think about President Trump, and he did a particularly high-profile press conference yesterday. Let me play a little clip of it, and he's talking about Russian meddling here. Let's have a look.
By the Democrats, they know it.
What about the message that's being
They
sent
did the
to
same
women
thing
who
with the
are
Russia
watching?
investigation. They tried to convince people that I had something to do with Russia. There was no collusion. Think of it. I'm in Wisconsin. I'm in Michigan. I say, gee, we're not doing well. I won both those states. We're not doing well. Let me call the Russians to help. Does anybody really believe that? It's a con job.
Liliana, do some of the Russians believe it's a con job? Is there something to this Russian investigation? How are you reporting it?
Well, I'd say that, generally speaking, it does not seem that Russian media, especially Russian state media, covered the situation with Mueller's investigation precisely. And I'd say what the state propaganda does in Russia, they just pick an enemy outside of the country and blame that enemy for everything which is not going well. It's a very old Soviet strategy when, you know, it's just easier to explain ordinary people why they have to deal with such bad things as, you know, as a weak economy, as many laws that make their lives even more complicated. And I'd say that the only angle which we can see, if we talk about the state media, I'm not talking about all Russian media, because as we know, there are some professional media outlets who still do their job very, very well. But so when I just want to emphasize the fact that when I refer to Russian TV, I refer mostly to the state propaganda. So all those late shows depict the states as a threat, and obviously there is nothing good that is said about the U.S. On that shows. But at the same time, when it comes to discussing Donald Trump, then the angle slightly changes. So still, I'd say Russian audience doesn't really have access to quality coverage of the U.S. affairs because, well, TV is still the most powerful instrument of propaganda, and only educated liberals are those people who follow quality newspapers.
I understand.
Right.
Yeah, thank you.
Now, Uliana, I think that's an interesting point you're making about the view from state-run TV. Here's a tweet we got from someone named Aresa who talks about internet media in Russia. She says mainstream ones cover President Trump's trade war, sanctions, military activities, and sometimes they do analytics about the political shift in the U.S., but collusion is rarely mentioned as Russians consider it to be overrated. Now, Alla, of course, if someone who is here, you're in Boston, collusion is a term that comes up a lot in the U.S. when it comes to Russia. Can you talk to us about, via your research, why this might be seen as overrated in Russia?
Why the collusion term seems to be overrated in Russia. So it seems to me that although the recent studies like Pew Research Center, and I believe there was also a Gallup poll, indicate that Russians overwhelmingly do not believe that Russia interfered in the U.S. election. Also, simultaneously, they believe that something like 80% of all Russian respondents believe that the U.S., on the other hand, interferes in elections around the globe and in the domestic affairs of other countries. It seems that the average Russian citizen believes that in a unipolar world in which the U.S. dominates, these are sort of the means that are available to the Russian state. This is what the Russian state has at its disposal to counteract that unipolarity just a little bit, to just change the balance a little bit in its favor. And so because they believe that it's a noble goal, in this case, the ends justify the means.
Right. I want to move on a little bit now and have a look deeper into the issue of online trolling. Have a listen to the Twitter CEO, Jack Dorsey, and Facebook COO, Sheryl Sandberg. They were testifying in front of a Senate Intelligence Committee earlier on this month.
We found ourselves unprepared and ill-equipped for the immensity of the problems that we've acknowledged. Abuse, harassment, troll armies, propaganda through bots and human coordination, misinformation campaigns, and divisive filter bubbles. That's not a healthy public square.
When content violates our policies, we will take it down. And when our opponents use new techniques, we will share them so we can strengthen our collective efforts. Everyone here today knows that this is an arms race, and that means we need to be ever more vigilant.
A lot of the social platforms right now are trying to get rid of bots. They're trying to get rid of propaganda and influencers and news that is, I hate the phrase, I'm not going to say F news, but news that is not actually news. This is your wheelhouse. This is what you study. From the other side, from the east looking across to the west, is this a fantastic success story for the digital world in Russia?
Oh, that's an excellent question. It's such a huge undertaking that these social media giants have in front of them, because it's tremendously difficult to keep up with these accounts that keep springing up. So just recently in the news, Facebook has shared that, again, they're tracking multiple accounts that are disseminating fake news stories and slanted news stories on Syria that are, again, traced back to Russia. Twitter is constantly dealing with the same. It's by no means a success story. It's something that is very much an uncharted territory. how do you regulate the online space, which should be democratic and open to all sorts of voices, while at the same time not allowing it to become this sort of a divisive platform that is dominated by narratives that are clearly not conducive to universal norms of democracy and human rights and things like that.
Anna, go ahead. I can see your mouth opening. I was going to go to you with the tweet,
yes.
but I'm interested to hear what you have to say first.
Well, when I've been reporting on Troll Factory a lot, obviously, being based in Moscow and covering the news. The factory in St. Petersburg that, as we know, belongs to Mr. Prigozhin, who is also known on the West as Putin's cook, has been growing bigger. They now occupy a bigger building and they employ more people who work on salaries and who post certain messages on Facebook and on Twitter every day. That's their job. But I was also recently working in Macedonia, where they hire trolls too. So it seems that trolls as a job, everyday job, a troll, is a kind of a trend. So young people don't mind to be working as trolls and getting paid. For young people in Russia, any job is good because the economy is going down. And some young people hit the streets and they protest against Putin, and other kids are ready to participate in Putin's propaganda and work for Putin's propaganda machine.
Anna, do you call trolls in Russia? What's the Russian for troll?
Yeah, you can call them trolls. You can also call them propagandists. It is
what do they call them?
Define,
what do they call
really.
themselves?
That's a good question. I've only interviewed one troll woman who did not admit that she was a troll. She just quit that job. She was angry because she was not paid enough money, or the money she thought she was meant to be paid. And she criticized the factory, and she described to me how the factory looks inside, which is very interesting. Every floor, she said, had a special code. You could not access more floors than just the one where you worked. You worked in a cubicle, but every morning there were slogans, some ideas on the wall for, let's call them trolls, to get the message, what they're going to tweet about or to post about that day. So it's a very much controlled, as far as I understand, institution where young people do not get paid much, but they're still willing to have, as I said, any job.
Uliana?
I'd like to point out that Russian trolls and Russian hackers seem to be different units. And while trolls, that's the job for civilians, and Russian hackers. Well, it wasn't news that Russian Ministry of Defense started hiring hackers approximately in summer of 2013, and we didn't really. Well, basically, dissenters and journalists are getting hacked on a daily basis, but we didn't hear about really big stories for a while. And I think the hacking stories started to pop up maybe in 2015, where we all knew for sure those cyber units exist.
Sure.
If I might interject.
Go ahead.
Oh, yes. So I would like to point out, from the point of view of international relations scholar, as far as relationships between states are concerned, and sort of informational war being one type of war, right, that a state can wage against another state. If you think about it, hiring an army of online trolls is an excellent choice for any state, right? Because these are people who, one, don't cost very much. Waging an information war by hiring a bunch of people whose technical expertise need not be greater than just being able to post, a Facebook post or tweet a tweet. Or create hashtags or what have you. It's really, really cheap. It's much cheaper than training cyber operations or, buying missiles or creating missiles, things like that. And the second aspect of this is that this gives the states plausible deniability, because whenever you try to sort of pin down responsibility for, who interfered, when, and how, the Kremlin can always plausibly claim that these are people who are just sort of patriotic citizens who are disseminating their own agenda that may or may not coincide with that of the Kremlin. So from those 2 points of view,
right. And here we should remember the story about so-called green people in Crimea. Do you ladies remember that story when, there were people wearing green uniform without any signs that would allow to say what country they represent, and Russia kept denying those were Russian soldiers. And then there was another, about maybe half a year later, there was Putin's press conference when he admitted that those people were Russians. And basically that's how whatever happens on the US soil, they always can take credit for it. And then the rest of the world would be thinking that, oh, those Russian hackers or Russian trolls, they are really dangerous. And that's how Putin will benefit from the situation.
Uliana, I think that's an interesting point. I wanted to share a few from our audience listening to this. So on YouTube Live, Backpacker Guy, that's his handle, writes in, I am concerned about trolls. Negative propaganda aimed at the easily influenced creates artificial support for a fake movement. So saying that unfortunately there are people out there who will be swayed by this. So I wanted to give an example of what that might look like. This is via BuzzFeed News, an article not too long ago. This came out in August. This is how Russian propaganda actually works in the 21st century. And in it, the reporters went into how the Russian government funded a group of seemingly independent news websites in Eastern Europe to put out stories dictated by the Kremlin. Here's one of the authors of that article. Holger says the propaganda works in many different layers, and part of it is public, the other part is hidden and meant to look like real and independent news media. They take a lot of effort to hide the financing scheme and the coordination of topics. So if you decide not to trust the official propaganda sites, you might still take these topics seriously if independent sites cover the same thing. Anna, does this surprise you at all? And what do you think it says about U.S.-Russia relations right now that so many Americans are going on these sites and then believing this information?
Yeah, I was just thinking actually about that before you asked that. For me personally, and my friends, my circle of friends, some journalists, some are not journalists, a troll is pretty recognizable. We'd identify a troll. It's very easy, because messages seem too robotic, and you can easily check if it's a troll or not a troll writing to you. Some people do really interesting analysis now, and there was a helpful post recently. Somebody identified trolls among my friends, and I thank that person for that. But let's just go back a little bit. Uliana was talking about Russians getting information from television. Majority of Russians actually do believe, or they might be skeptical, but they receive information from television. And less than 70% of Russians travel abroad. But Russian elite, the majority of rich people, Russia's rich people, live in Moscow, the biggest city of the biggest number of billionaires, right? Their children study abroad. And I personally know quite a few Russian officials who had babies in Miami, who have wives living in London, who have huge apartments.
Yeah.
And they do follow the news. They do read news in English. They read the New York Times. That's why, for instance, today, Izvestia is one of the most read Russian state newspapers, talked about Trump's conflict with the New York Times correspondent. When Trump and New York Times correspondent had a little argument during a press conference about whether the New York Times is a failing newspaper or a very successful newspaper. So I'm not surprised to read that article in a Russian newspaper today.
Yeah, that's really intriguing. All right, so it's such a fascinating relationship between Russia and the US. I want to share here the Russian Foreign Minister. His name is Sergey Lavrov. Ladies, you already know that for our broader audience, just in case you don't. On September the 21st, he was commenting on the latest US sanctions targeted at Russia. Have a look.
As for the new sanctions, which the U.S. has imposed on some Russian legal entities and people, we have stopped getting surprised about them, particularly in regards to sanctions against the Russian aircraft manufacturer and factory. These sanctions are nothing else but yet another act of unfair competition. And I think we all once again understood that the U.S. dollar system has completely discredited itself and that the confidence in the dollar is plummeting.
So, Alla, on the one hand, you've got these US sanctions, and on the other hand, you have two presidents, President Putin, President Trump, who seem to be really good buddies and like each other and say that in public whenever they get an opportunity. That seems to me deeply confusing from the Russian side looking out to the US. Is it confusing?
I don't know about the Russian side. I don't know how well I represent that, but it certainly is a unique moment in history in terms of the relationship between the two countries, because we have, as you said, on the one hand, the relationship has nearly hit its nadir, right? Because the two countries have been fairly hostile with one another ever since the annexation of Crimea in 2014 and the installment of these sanctions that have not gone away. Then the next big crisis was the interference in the 2016 election, of course. But on the other hand, as you pointed out, we have this highly personalistic relationship, highly idiosyncratic between the two leaders. I think it would be overstated to say that President Putin feels exactly the same about President Trump as vice versa, because it seems like on the side of Putin, there's more amusement toward Trump, whereas Trump sort of really does seem to genuinely admire the guy. It also, I think, an important implication of this is that we see that Trump's base, the Republican base, really follows him in this assessment of Russia. So even though we see that the U.S. public opinion is still largely negative when it comes to, do you feel favorably about Russia or not, Republicans are twice as likely to think that Russia is good than Democrats. So at least the president's base is following. And so at this moment, it's really quite unclear to me where this might go. Maybe this means that there will be, some sort of a reset of the bilateral relationship, and maybe this will mean an improvement in the relationship. But a lot of it also depends on what will happen in 2018, right? If we observe another blatant, informational attack, which I don't think might happen, but if we do, I don't see, any possibility of improvement.
Do you think that Russian trolls are having trouble figuring out what they're supposed to say about Trump? Sometimes I think that one day official Russia hates Trump. The other day, official Russia loves and celebrates Trump again. And then official Russia hates
That's a great
Congress
point.
and blames everything on Congress. So poor troll is sitting in the factory thinking, what am I going to say about Trump today, right?
Well,
actually, there are different...
Ladies, the result of what you were talking about is represented in this tweet here. I just wanted to share this before we run out of time. Yuval says the result of what you all are talking about right now is that there are two different Russia policies, one of Trump and another of the rest of the government. And whenever Trump leaves office, hostility to Russia will have bipartisan consensus. Femi?
You've been watching Anna and Alla and Uliana. They're all Russian. Thank you for our all Russian lineup. It's been very, very revealing to see the world from your perspective. Our conversation continues always online. You can find us on Twitter @AJStream. Luke and I will see you soon. Thanks for watching, everybody. Take care.